So yeah, like Sam said, I'm going to be talking today about remote onboarding, or as we should probably start calling it, just regular, normal, standard onboarding. But yeah, before we get too far into it, who am I? Why should you care about what I say? That's me. I've, since that picture was taken, inflicted a bit of a lockdown haircut on myself, which is met with mixed reviews. My name's Adriaan. My wife calls me Adriaan. My 10-month-old daughter calls me a series of very cute grunts. So I'm not too picky. I do like the last one, but only when she's doing it. Academically, my background is in industrial psychology and sociology. Professionally, I've spent the last 5-6 years in startups and recruitment. The last 3 and a bit of those have been at OfferZen. If you know anything about OfferZen, then maybe it's clear why that puts me in a pretty interesting position to be able to make observations like this. But maybe just to give you a sense of the numbers, because of my position sort of at the center of our talent marketplace, I've been able to engage with probably over 400 companies up till now and help them grow their teams by a number more than that. Before we go too much further, again, if you know about OfferZen, you know that we like to spread the love swag-wise at events we go to. So you'll see on the screen is a QR code that you can scan if you would like to be entered into a competition to win a swag drop for yourself and your team. And yeah, winners will be notified after the conference. And I will show the slide again at the end in case you haven't been able to get out your QR code reader within the next few seconds. 3, 2, 1. Cool. So context, why are we talking about this? Some of you may already have really solid, well thought out onboarding processes prior to all of this happening. I'm reasonably confident that close to 0 of these programs would have survived the switch to a fully remote world without any kind of adaptation. And this poses the question, are what remains of these processes still as effective as they could be? Why is that, and what can we do to improve them? And then before we go too much further, it's worth pointing out that this isn't an academic question. Businesses with effective onboarding programs realize real tangible benefits in the form of up to 82% improvements in new hire productivity and up to a 70% improvement in new hire retention, meaning that the candidates that you're working so hard to attract and interview will be more effective and will stay with you for longer. On the flip side of that, having a negative onboarding experience can result in new joiners being up to twice as likely to start their search for opportunities outside of your business sooner than they would have otherwise. So it's not just a fun thought experiment, there's real business implications for this as well. So to this end, there are 3 broad topics that I'd like to discuss today. Firstly, how has COVID-19 and the associated sudden shift to remote working and hiring affected onboarding, the challenges and opportunities presented by this shift, and then finally, I'd like to share a couple of actionable tips that I've seen from where I'm sitting to be effective in supplementing your own potentially, hopefully existing remote candidate onboarding process. So it begins. How's onboarding changed? It's worth looking at that first, I think. To start answering that question, let's examine a process that might have seemed completely normal in the far away, unthinkable past of January 2020. So I'll run you through a hypothetical situation that is potentially not that hypothetical. So step 1, candidate goes through all your regular interviews and assessments. You decide to make them an offer. Cool. As is best practice, you decide to give them a phone call, walk them through the offer, build some excitement, get them on board. Let's assume in this case they're ecstatic and they gleefully sign the offer letter. Well done. A short while before their start date, you arrange to meet up with them to start signing relevant contracts, NDAs, etc. And then before you know it, their first day comes around, they show up slightly overdressed, as is normal, but otherwise super excited to start working with you. You hand them their laptops, as well as some thoughtful swag. And since it's almost lunchtime, you bring them to the kitchen area to introduce them to the rest of the team, who are invariably gathered there, eating their respective lunches, bantering, having a good time. Great opportunity to socialize them. After lunch, after everybody's had a great time meeting each other, you walk with them to their new team, leave them in the attentive care of their new team lead, safe in the knowledge that if they have any specific questions about the rest of the process or their new job, they can just tap somebody on the shoulder, get pointed in the right direction, and they'll sort themselves out. While walking away, you smile to yourself ever so slightly. Another job well done. Go me, Recruiter of the Year 2020. So, despite the somewhat dramatized delivery there, I think most of you will agree this is a pretty reasonable approximation of what a given candidate's first day on the job might look like. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Let's take a look at how that exact same sequence of events might have played out in July or August 2020 with the small added complexity of a worldwide virulent pandemic. So, step one, after a full suite of remote interviews, you decide to make an offer. The changes here are pretty far-reaching, but given the scope of our discussion, I think let's just assume that they conclude without a hitch, which is a pretty big assumption, but let's roll with it. You call them on their cell phone to pass along the good news, but you're told, that's great to hear. I'm going to need a bit more time because I just got off a Zoom call with a company in the Netherlands where I'm interviewing, and they seem really cool and interesting and friendly too, and they're offering to move me to the Netherlands. Not to be phased, in the end, you're able to win them over with your charm and convincing arguments. And a few weeks before the candidate's first day, you send them some documentation to fill in and sign, which they do. However, a day before they start, you get a somewhat snarky message from your legal team saying that a Word document with a photograph of the candidate's signature visibly pasted at the bottom of the page is unfortunately not going to cut it. So you're going to need to make another plan, which, as always, you do. At the same time, you get a notification that laptops are on back order and won't be able to be delivered to the candidate's home in time. So you end up having to dig out an older one, arrange to have it couriered, maybe driving it there yourself, all masked up, etc. Maybe it's not a big deal. Hopefully they've got the same taste in stickers. Who knows? When they log in / show up for their first day of work, you start trying to introduce them to the rest of the team, but half of the people seem to be away or in a meeting at any given time. And the team lunch that you were counting on doesn't just happen anymore, since there isn't an eating area unless you're counting people's respective kitchens. You try to cobble something together in terms of getting a group over Zoom, but it's too short notice, so the two of you end up having a pretty awkward sandwich lunch session for our video conferencing. Not to be defeated this easily, you let them know that their team lead will be in touch after lunch to walk them through their first set of onboarding tasks. However, that evening, you find out that because of a childcare emergency, they didn't actually hear anything from their team lead until just before 5. And in the interim, your precious new starter was sitting around in their home office desk, refreshing their inbox, not sure who to reach out to for help, and every now and then wistfully lingering on LinkedIn, trying to decide whether or not it's actually worth updating where they currently work. So again, I'm willing to concede that maybe I turned up the drama a bit there, but I think you'll probably agree that it sounds pretty plausible given everything else that's going on. And I'm willing to bet that anybody who's done any kind of onboarding of new hires recently has experienced at least one of these to some degree. So what's changed? Let's take another look at that scenario in a bit more detail and look at some of the underlying factors. So firstly, for better or for worse, the large-scale shift to remote work has democratized access to talent for everyone. If everyone is working remotely anyway, why would I limit myself to candidates who just so happen to be in the same city or even country as I am? This can be a really big advantage when you're the one who's able to broaden your talent pool, but it can also be a pretty big disadvantage if you're the one who's not able to compete with the new entrants to the market for whatever reason. Secondly, maybe this is a controversial take, but potentially one of the positive things to come out of all of this is that pen and paper document management is hopefully finally going to be a thing of the past. Signing documents manually and filing them in an actual cabinet in 2020 needed to stop. So please, let's put our heads together and do that. Thirdly, in terms of that lunch gathering you are hoping to use as an opportunity to make introductions, these kinds of spontaneous gatherings and connections don't just happen anymore. You need to plan them very intentionally. And that's a word we're going to come back to a couple of times in the next few minutes. Intentionality. Finally, the shift to remote work doesn't just mean that people are doing the exact same thing as they were, but in their pajamas at home. Schedules and ways of working have changed as well. Without the physical constraints of office life, you need to seriously re-examine whether or not all of your traditional rituals and processes still make sense. This isn't necessarily bad, it's just different. And in fact, the data suggests that remote workers are overall happier, more productive, and more likely to recommend your organization to their peers as a potential place of employment than their office-based counterparts. So there is a sort of prize at the end of all of this as well. So we've successfully established, I think, that a widespread global pandemic and the associated unprecedented societal and economic shifts that come along with it have resulted in a few things needing to change. Not quite a revelation at this point. However, let's talk about what we can do to adapt to these changes. So to keep things brief, I'll limit my discussion to my 3 favorite tweaks that I've seen to be really impactful out in the wild, so to speak. To summarize them, firstly, giving candidates ownership of the process by using smart checklists, sort of co-opting the rest of your team by using and implementing a buddy system, and then thirdly, making sure that you integrate them into the team with intention, with intentionality. So let's look at the first one, checklists. I love checklists. If you speak to my wife, you'll know that I do not go to the shops without a checklist, and if it's not on the checklist, it doesn't get purchased. However, the reason I like them for onboarding in particular is twofold. Firstly, you can run them asynchronously, which is ideal when you're remote, in that you can assign it to somebody, explain it, and then you can each move on with your respective tasks. On top of that, it also gives the new joiner a nice degree of autonomy and ownership over the onboarding process. What this doesn't mean is that you shouldn't be giving them guidance in the process. Indications of how long a task might take, as well as its relative priority, will go a long way to helping new joiners decide in which order to tackle particular tasks. And any prioritization input from you can also give a lot of context around why certain tasks are dependent on one another and why it's important that one thing gets done for another, before another, for example. You also need to be really sure that new joiners have a regular cadence of check-ins with their managers to discuss progress and make sure that they've got direction and aren't getting stuck. It's very important. And it's also worth saying explicitly, I think, that not everything on this checklist needs to be completely serious. And when I say serious, it doesn't, not every single thing needs to drive sort of revenue in the bottom line. A theme, I think, in remote onboarding and just, I think, work in general these days, I suppose, is that you need to be actively looking out for ways to proactively surface your organizational culture outside of scenarios that would have historically just occurred more organically. In this case, as an example, why not add a few items to your onboarding checklist that directs people to socialize with people in other parts of the business? If you're in a tech company, for example, why not assign them to go take a Zoom selfie with someone or some people from the product team, as an example? Speaking of examples, this is a snippet of a onboarding checklist that I recently used to onboard a few new members who started in our account management team earlier this year. In case you're wondering, we do not have anybody by the name of Terry Dactyl just yet, but our recruitment team is working on that, I'm told. If you take a look here, you'll see that the one thing worth pointing out, we tried to group the tasks that would have the most impact on further learning in the first few weeks. So, for example, learning how to find your way around the CRM and starting to sit in on meetings and calls with more senior members of the team goes a long way to setting them up with a good base of knowledge that they can build on. In later subsequent weeks, you might start assigning somewhat less critical tasks, such as reading or watching videos and things that you think will give them context as to how the rest of the team or the business tends to think about things. Another practice that I cannot recommend enough is implementing an onboarding buddy system. This might sound really obvious, and I'm sure a bunch of you are already doing this. However, the data shows that despite 87% of organizations who use a system like this, finding it to be an effective way to speed up new hire proficiency, less than half of businesses actually end up using one. Kind of a weird stat. So what do I like about it, and why is it especially useful for remote onboarding? To me, the most obvious benefit is the establishment of clear and explicit points of contact. When remote onboarding becomes, or when onboarding becomes completely remote, it's really easy for ambiguity to creep in. You've just joined a group of 10, 20, 100 people who all seem to know each other really well. I'm sitting here alone in my house, not knowing who the right person to ask what I should be doing next is. This isn't a quick question of introversion versus extroversion, it's just information overload and actually ambiguity overload. On top of this, I find it's also a really great way to codify access to socialization within the team, as well as forming a natural touch point from which to pass along existing tribal knowledge that's already within the team. In this instance, stories, I find, often serve as the vehicle through which organizations pass on their culture and important learnings. So if you're trying to figure out who should be on the sort of onboarding buddy committee, try to pick somebody who's got some stories to tell, or even better, somebody who's made some mistakes and learned from them. Those are the best ones. And then finally, this kind of arrangement can also serve as a really great opportunity for more senior members of the team to take on additional responsibility, while also giving them opportunities to develop their mentoring and coaching skills, which is really, really useful for development within the existing team. So I know what you're thinking, Adriaan. I'm totally 110% sold. An onboarding buddy system sounds great. Sign me up for that 87% increase in reported instances of faster new hire ramp up time. Really, really great stuff. How do I go about rolling this out? Firstly, select a buddy, obviously. Some criteria that you might use could include how tenured are they? That's, I think, the easy one. Ideally, an onboarding buddy should be a bit more of a long-standing member of the team who's already a strong performer. Secondly, the one that I think gets kind of tragically overlooked the most, do they actually want to be part of this process? Do they actually want to be an onboarding buddy? Assigning this role to somebody who just kind of wants to put their head down and focus on their own work will probably end up being a bit of an unpleasant process for both parties. And then finally, potentially also maybe obviously try to pick somebody with already strong interpersonal and communication ability to really make this shine. So once you've picked somebody, next step, introduce them to the new joiner as early as possible, potentially even before day one, and then brief them separately. You need to give them both really clear guidelines around what the expectations and outputs of this partnership will be, and do not forget to check in with both of them regularly around their process. Remember that the goal here is to monitor progress and enable both of them, not to micromanage, please. And then finally, feel free to get a bit jazzy with this. Improvise. There's a lot of scope for improvisation here. There's not even really a good reason why you need to have just one buddy. Buffer, a pretty well-known international fully remote company, they include up to 3 in their remote onboarding program. They've got a role buddy, a culture buddy, and a leadership buddy, all of them with different mandates. And if this sounds a bit out there to you, it's probably worth keeping in mind that these kinds of relationships probably would have likely arisen organically in a physical setting. Being remote just means that you need to be much more intentional in creating these connections, which is something to think about. And then lastly, on the topic of intentionality, the word that I've said an uncomfortable amount of times in the last few minutes probably, my last tip is to be sure that you're extremely intentional in how you approach integrating new joiners into the existing team. To me, this can mean a number of things. Firstly, the most, I think, the low-hanging fruit here, actively encourage existing team members to reach out and welcome new joiners. As you probably know, it can be really awkward to be a new person and have no idea who's who. So why not DM a few people in the team directly, ask them to introduce themselves to a new joiner. People, I'm sure, have good intentions, but it's easy to get swept up in other stuff. You just need to push them in the right direction. Secondly, publicizing new joiners. Back when we were office-based, seems like an eternity ago, but I can remember some parts of it. Every now and then, I'd find some tastefully designed posters in the lift and on the fridge describing who was starting soon, when they were joining, some interesting stuff about them. This practice was pretty easily moved onto a digital platform such as Slack or Teams, I imagine, where you can post these sort of updates in public channels and they can be commented on and reacted to. And that's also quite easy to orchestrate. What is also quite useful, I found, is having a list of who's who in the team with a short description of their role, what they're responsible for, and just what kinds of things people can talk to them about, and then broadcast this to new joiners. This makes it a lot less scary when they get to know the team because they've likely seen or heard of somebody before they interact, and they can talk to them about whatever was in their who's who biography that you shared with them. It takes a lot of the anxiety out of those initial interactions. And then finally, beyond integrating into the wider team, as a manager, you need to be very explicit about the relationship that you want to have with the new joiner. given how much of communication is actually non-verbal, which is anywhere between 70 and 90%, depending on who you ask, you'll both need to be extra clear about goals and expectations from both sides. Something that's worked for us is to document these expectation discussions in something that you can both edit, like a Google Doc or something, and then both parties can access it and edit it and refer it back to it whenever they need. So to summarize, my top 3 tips: turn onboarding into a collaborative experience with smart checklists, involve the rest of your team by creating an onboarding buddy system, be intentional with how you foster engagement between new hires and the existing team in this new digital realm. Those are my 3 recommendations. To wrap things up a bit, a lot of things are in flux right now, but I think the only thing that probably seems like a bit of a safe bet is that things aren't most likely going to go back to exactly how they were before anytime soon. What I'd specifically like to leave you all with today is the idea that whatever you were doing to onboard new starters 6 months ago probably can't be kept in place just with "but on the internet" tacked onto the end of it. Fundamental changes need to happen, and everybody in this room / Zoom call, whatever we're calling it, needs to adapt and make the most of the situation. Hopefully I've given you a few ideas to consider when you're next examining how you're onboarding these precious candidates on whom we all spend so much time and effort in recruiting. Any questions for anyone? And there's that Q&A.
Adriaan, I see a question coming through from Tian. How do you do remote onboarding for lower level staff with limited access to technology, and or remote onboarding for a decentralized workforce or team?
That is a great question. I'll be the first to admit that that's not really my strong suit. For the most part, I work with people in a very technical capacity, so engineers, developers, things like that. The team I'm on, account management, so I guess it's not quite on that level, but we pretty much treat it the same. So maybe the answer is, if you're able to, give them the same treatment. So for example, we for the most part use a similar process to onboard account managers as we would somebody on a technical team. I guess maybe saving the very domain specific stuff, like the developers are going to be need to be added onto various accounts and things, but they are, I guess, equivalents for people in more business facing roles. So I would say, as much as you can, treat them the same. If you're dealing with sort of mass recruitment, like if we're talking like staffing a whole like shopping center, I unfortunately don't have much useful advice for that.
Thanks, Adriaan. And another question around the integration, the intentional integration.
Yes.
What are some of the lessons that some of your tech company clients have learned? I mean, and I'm talking about really hard lessons learned about trying to integrate as seamlessly as possible. It's a remote environment. You're no longer able to spontaneously interact or engage or grab a cup of coffee. What are some of the lessons learned as they've tried to transition to this new way of working when it comes to integrating newbies?
So to me, the big one, and that's a pretty good question, I think, it really sort of cuts to the heart of things. If you think something goes without saying, it probably doesn't. That's a trap that's really easy to fall into. If you think like, this is so obvious that I shouldn't actually have to tell people I'm going to focus on some high level stuff, don't do that. There are things, especially if you've been at your business for a while, there are things that you do that make no sense at all to somebody who hasn't been in the business for as long as you do. And I've seen that happen. Like if we're talking about how we onboard new customers, I'll take people through the whole process, and I'll skip some pretty foundational stuff, potentially because I think it's so obvious. The hard part about this, to me personally, has been figuring out the things that go without saying and then saying them. So it's like really challenging those foundational assumptions. Do I need to tell somebody that if we're presenting a business review to a CTO, do I need to tell them that we shouldn't just use like a little clip art speech bubble to put in my thoughts? the answer is yes. I should tell people that that isn't what we should do, but it's not obvious because in their previous role, maybe that was totally fine. Who knows? I know that probably sounds quite superficial, but to me, that's been the biggest learning, is just what are the basics and say them out loud and list them if you can.
Thanks for that, Adriaan. I think we've got time for one last question. John is asking, do you do onboarding on a special app, or is it done via an HRIS system? Buddy Up felt like an app to them. So they're effectively asking, is there an app or is it an HR system?
This is a tough question because there almost certainly is an app. And hey, if you want to use Buddy Up as an app name, it's yours. I relinquish my rights on that. Maybe buddyyup.io or something. But no, in terms of tooling, I tried to keep things quite simple as possible. The baseline is some like collaborative document processing application. So for example, sort of Google Office Suite, Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides, anything that I can access simultaneously to somebody else and we can both edit. That's kind of the core of these things. I honestly don't know how you do any remote work, I suppose, without access to some sort of tool like that. There's probably some way you can integrate your existing HRIS system. I'm not sure if Workable has a status as onboarding buddy or anything like that. But ultimately, I don't think it's necessary. That's like, to me, that's a very high level enhancement. I'd want to get the basics right. I'd want people collaborating on documents, fundamentally. I want people looking at the same thing and being able to work together on it. So whenever we've administered these things and run these things, the tool of choice for me, quite simply, Google Docs, Google Sheets. That's how I manage it.
Thanks, Adriaan. I'm going to squeeze in this last question because it's close to home for me.
Okay.
Before we move on to the next speaker. The question comes from Mahlape. How will you ensure that they are fully oriented on the organizational culture, given that they are working from home?
That is the question. I'm not sure what you can do beyond establishing a cadence early and then sticking to it. The only other thing that comes to mind is the other thing that I've learned is that onboarding takes longer than you think. So for example, saying, hey, we've got a month-long onboarding program. It's probably going to take more than a month. You want to extend that, even if it's just the sort of check-ins, even if you're not actively assigning tasks after a month. I want to be having onboarding check-ins within the 3-4 months probably, and that's where we're kind of, I guess, interrogating that stuff. Like, how are you feeling? How are you experiencing working at the business? I think it sort of goes back to that, like, ask the things that you don't think need to be asked because they're so obvious, but just saying like, hey, what is your experience like been so far working at OfferZen? How are you feeling? Like, are you feeling part of the team? Is there anything else that we can do to like sort of integrate you more? It's just like very direct. But there's obviously no silver bullet for anything. We only have lead bullets, for better or for worse. So my only take on that is just talk to people as often as possible and don't just leave it. I think what happens is, onboarding is a 3-month program. It's in the document. After 3 months, we give you an assessment or a review, and now you're part of the team. And that's not true. Like, you can't expect somebody to be as bought in month 4 as somebody who's been there for 2 or 3 years. You need to be constantly interrogating that stuff, and then also giving surface area. So this is kind of tangential, and I'll keep it brief. But things like team events and office events don't stop when you're fully remote. It feels like they should stop because it's really hard. But you now more than ever, you need to be talking to people, not necessarily just in a purely sort of results work-driven capacity, but in a more lighthearted sort of sense. So like doing events with people, just connecting on a more personal level over a longer period of time is absolutely necessary. And I think that's probably also going to be driving things like integration into company culture and things like that, because that's really when it's broadcast. You don't give people like, here's a 45-minute seminar on what our culture is, and we're going to give you a test afterwards. It's actually just living it for an extended period of time.
I guess it's a new way of living it now, Adriaan, since there's just, it's a different presence, it's a different level of interaction. And to your earlier and rather overused word. It's much more intentional. You've got to be a lot more structured about the approach and planning up front before newbies are onboarded into the organization. Well, thank you for that, Adriaan.
Thank you.
People, we're going to be moving on to